The ember of defiance. She Daniels wiped the grease from her hands, her eyes scanning the bustling auto repair shop. This place, a fortress of tools, car parts, and memories, was her sanctuary. It had been 5 years since Jess's death, but his presence lingered in every corner, the way he had organized the wrenches, the faded checklist pinned on the wall, and the framed photograph of him in his uniform. It wasn't just a shop. It was his legacy, and she had vowed to keep it alive. The late afternoon sun poured golden light into the yard, and for a moment, everything felt peaceful. But peace was a fragile thing, and she knew better than to trust it. The roar of motorcycle engines shattered the calm. She stiffened, her hand instinctively tightening around the wrench she'd just polished. 3 figures rolled in, the sound of their bikes rumbling like an ominous prelude. The bikers were clad in leather, their faces a mix of smirks and sneers that hinted at trouble. Mitch Callahan, their leader, was the first to dismount, his tattoos dark and jagged, like scars of past sins. He scanned the yard with a predatory gaze before locking eyes with she. "Nice place you've got here," Mitch drawled, his voice carrying an edge of mockery. "Bet it's worth a pretty penny." Dylan Matthews followed suit, younger and cockier, his grin widening as he spotted she. "Hey, sweetheart. You run this joint all by yourself. That's cute." Mark Thompson, the third member, lingered by his bike, his eyes darting around nervously. He didn't speak, but his hesitation made him seem less sure about this than the others. She stepped forward, her posture straight and unwavering. "What do you want?" Her tone was calm, but there was steel in her words. Mitch chuckled, running a hand through his unkempt hair. "Just passing through. Thought we'd see what kind of business a widow like you was running." The mention of her widowhood was deliberate, a jab meant to unsettle her, but she didn't bite. She had faced far worse than a few thugs trying to rattle her. "You've seen it," she replied evenly, gesturing to the shop behind her. "Now move along. I don't have time for games." Dylan snorted, stepping closer. "Feisty, aren't you? Bet you be real fun to mess with." She's eyes narrowed, her grip tightening on the wrench. "Touch anything here, and you'll regret it." Mark shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Mitch. "Maybe we should just go. No point in stirring up trouble." Mitch ignored him, his smirk growing wider. "Trouble? Nah, we're just getting started." He turned to Dylan, who had already begun pacing around one of the cars parked outside the shop. It was an older model sedan, freshly painted and the pride of she's latest project. Dylan ran his hand along the hood, leaving a greasy streak in his wake. "Nice ride," Dylan said mockingly. "Shame if something happened to it." She took a step closer, her voice dropping low. "I said, leave." The bikers laughed, their mockery echoing in the yard. Mitch leaned against one of the workbenches, picking up a spanner and twirling it lazily in his hand. "You're brave, I'll give you that," he said, his tone carrying an undercurrent of menace. "But bravery can be a dangerous thing." Dylan, emboldened by Mitch's words, pulled out a small canister of lighter fluid from his jacket. He shook it theatrically, the liquid sloshing inside. "You know what's really dangerous?" he taunted. "Fire." He moved toward the car, unscrewing the cap of the canister. She's heart pounded, but she forced herself to remain calm. "You don't want to do this," she warned. "Don't I?" Dylan challenged, a flicker of madness in his grin. The first splash of lighter fluid hit the car's hood, and she's composure cracked. "Stop," she yelled, stepping forward, but Mitch blocked her path, his hand shooting out to grab her arm. Ah, he said, his grip firm. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." She twisted out of his grasp, her free hand swinging the wrench. Mitch dodged it just in time, his eyes narrowing in surprise. "Feisty and dangerous," he muttered, a note of respect creeping into his voice. "I like it." Before she could move again, Dylan struck a match. The tiny flame danced in the evening air, a beacon of impending chaos. "Don't you dare," she growled, her voice shaking with rage. But Dylan did. He flicked the match onto the car, and the flames erupted instantly, racing across the hood with a ferocity that took her breath away. The bikers laughed as if it were some grand spectacle, their jeers blending with the roar of the fire. Mitch stepped back, admiring their handiwork. "Lesson 1, he said, his voice cold. "Don't mess with us." But as the flames grew, something shifted. Mitch's smugness faltered when he noticed she wasn't retreating. She stood her ground, her eyes locked on the blaze, not in fear, but in defiance. "You think this scares me," she said, her voice rising above the crackling fire. "You think you've won." Dylan, caught off guard by her composure, hesitated. "Lady, your car's on fire. And you're standing in a place you shouldn't be," she replied, her tone sharper than the wrench in her hand. Mitch frowned, sensing the shift in energy. "What's your game, lady?" "No game," she said, her gaze unwavering. "But you just made the biggest mistake of your lives." The bikers exchanged uneasy glances. Dylan's bravado began to waver, and even Mark looked like he regretted being there. Mitch took a step forward, trying to reclaim control. Big talk for someone with no backup. She smirked, and for the first time, there was fire in her eyes that rivaled the flames behind her. "Oh, I have backup," she said, "and you're about to meet it." From the shadows, the sound of an approaching car echoed through the yard. The roar of its engine was deep and authoritative, a sound that commanded attention. The bikers turned toward it, their expressions shifting from arrogance to uncertainty. The car pulled into the lot, its sleek black exterior glinting in the firelight. The driver's door opened, and a figure stepped out, a man whose presence was as commanding as the sound of his arrival. She's breath caught in her throat as recognition washed over her. "Jess," she whispered. The bikers froze, their bravado crumbling as they realized they were no longer in control. And in that moment, everything changed. The ghost of Jess Daniels. The fire raged on behind her, illuminating the yard with an eerie orange glow. She Daniels stood rooted to the spot, her heart hammering in her chest. The figure stepping out of the black car wasn't a ghost, but for a fleeting moment, it might as well have been. The man before her carried the same air of authority, the same piercing intensity in his eyes that Jess Daniels had once wielded so effortlessly. But it wasn't Jess. Agent Thomas Keller, Jess's closest friend and former partner in the federal agency, strode into the yard, his expression unreadable. He moved with the precision of a predator, his every step calculated. Though he lacked Jess's warmth, there was no mistaking the connection. This man was here for her, and he wasn't here to negotiate. Mitch Callahan's smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing as he sized up the newcomer. "And who the hell are you?" he demanded, his bravado slipping into something closer to unease. Agent Keller didn't answer immediately. His eyes scanned the scene, the burning car, the smirking bikers, and finally she. His jaw tightened when he saw her, soot-streaked, and clutching a wrench, standing her ground despite the chaos around her. "Keller," she breathed, relief and surprise mingling in her voice. She hadn't seen him since Jess's funeral, and even then, their conversation had been brief and formal. He'd promised to watch out for her, but she hadn't expected him to show up now, in the middle of this nightmare. Keller's gaze softened for a moment as he met her eyes, but the softness vanished as he turned back to the bikers. His voice, low and deadly, cut through the roar of the fire like a blade. "Step away from the woman. Now." Dylan Matthews, emboldened by his earlier antics, let out a derisive laugh. "And what are you gonna do if we don't, old man? Call the cops." Keller's lips curled into a humorless smile. "No, I don't need the cops to handle you." The menace in his tone made even Mitch shift uncomfortably. Dylan, oblivious to the tension in the air, took a swaggering step forward. "Big words," he sneered. "Let's see if you can back 'em up." Before Dylan could say another word, Keller moved. It was fast, too fast for anyone to react. One moment he was standing still, and the next he had Dylan's arm twisted behind his back, forcing the younger biker to his knees. The canister of lighter fluid clattered to the ground as Dylan cried out in pain. "I don't play games," Keller said, his voice a growl. "You think you're tough because you can light a match. Try me." Mitch surged forward, anger flashing across his face. "Hey, get your hands off him." Keller didn't even glance his way. "I'd think very carefully about your next move," he warned, tightening his grip on Dylan's arm. The younger biker let out another pained yelp, his earlier bravado completely gone. "Unless you want to end up like your friend here." Mark Thompson, who had been lingering at the edge of the scene, finally spoke up, his voice shaky. "Mitch, maybe we should just—" "Shut up, Mark," Mitch snapped, his focus locked on Keller. But the uncertainty in his tone betrayed him. He was losing control of the situation, and he knew it. She watched the scene unfold, a mixture of relief and awe coursing through her. Keller's presence was like a lifeline, a reminder that she wasn't as alone as she'd thought. But it also brought back memories she tried to bury. The nights Jesse would come home battered but triumphant, his stories laced with danger and resolve. This was the world Jesse had lived in, and now it had come crashing back into hers. "Let him go," Mitch said, his voice wavering as he tried to sound authoritative. "You've made your point." Keller finally released Dylan, who crumpled to the ground, clutching his arm and glaring up at him. "You're gonna regret this," Dylan hissed, but the fear in his eyes was unmistakable. "No," Keller said, straightening and brushing his hands off as if nothing had happened. "You're the one who's going to regret it. If you come near her again, if you so much as look at her shop the wrong way, I'll make sure you spend the rest of your miserable life regretting every decision that brought you here. Do you understand?" Mitch bristled, his fists clenching at his sides. But he didn't make a move. He glanced at She, who stood silently, watching him with a defiance that made his skin crawl. This wasn't over, and they both knew it. But for now, the odds weren't in his favor. "Let's go," Mitch growled, jerking his head toward his bike. Dylan and Mark hesitated for a moment before following his lead. Within seconds, the three bikers had mounted their motorcycles and roared out of the yard, disappearing into the night. As the sound of their engines faded, the silence that followed was almost deafening. Keller turned to She, his expression softening once more. "Are you okay?" She nodded, though her hands were still trembling. "I'm fine. Thanks to you." Keller sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I got the call about them a few hours ago. They've been causing trouble in the area, but I didn't realize they'd come after you." She frowned, her brow furrowing. "How did you know to come here?" Keller hesitated, glancing toward the still-burning car. Let's just say Jesse had some safeguards in place. He didn't trust anyone, not even me, to keep you safe, so he made sure there were people watching. The weight of his words hit her like a punch to the gut. Jess's paranoia, his constant need to prepare for the worst, had always been a point of tension between them. But now, standing in the aftermath of the biker's attack, she realized how much she owed him for it. "I didn't know," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. Keller placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm but reassuring. "You weren't supposed to, but now you do. And now we deal with this." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with determination. "They'll be back." "I know," Keller replied, his tone grim. "And when they come, we'll be ready." Together, they turned back toward the shop, the firelight casting long shadows behind them. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like she wasn't fighting alone. Building the fortress. The next morning, the acrid scent of burnt metal and rubber still hung heavy in the air. The skeleton of She's once pristine car sat in the yard, a blackened reminder of the previous night's chaos. She Daniels stood before it, her arms crossed over her chest, as if trying to shield herself from the memories that threatened to overwhelm her. Agent Thomas Keller leaned against the wall of the shop, sipping from a steaming cup of coffee. He had stayed through the night, ensuring there were no more surprises, The two of them had barely spoken since the bikers fled, the weight of unspoken thoughts hanging between them. "What are you thinking?" Keller asked, breaking the silence. She turned to him, her jaw set. "I'm thinking this isn't over. Mitch and his gang. They won't just let this go." Keller nodded, his expression grim. "You're right. They'll come back. But next time, we'll be ready." "We?" She raised an eyebrow, a hint of sarcasm slipping into her tone. "You're sticking around." Keller's lips quirked into a small, humorless smile. "Like I said, Jesse put things in motion to make sure you were never alone. I'm part of that plan." She studied him for a moment, searching for any hint of insincerity. Keller was as unreadable as ever, but there was something in his tone, a sense of duty, maybe even guilt, that made her believe him. "Fine," she said finally, "but I'm not going to sit around waiting for them to strike again. If they want a fight, I'll give them one." Keller's eyes gleamed with approval. "Good, because waiting isn't an option." Over the next few days, the shop transformed. What had once been a humble auto repair yard became a fortress. Keller's training and experience as a federal agent came into play as he helped she reinforce the property. They installed motion sensors, cameras, and high-powered floodlights around the perimeter. Keller even managed to source a reinforced steel door for the shop's main entrance, a stark contrast to the flimsy wooden one that had been there before. She threw herself into the work, channeling her anger and fear into every task. She reinforced the windows with metal grates, patched up holes in the fencing, and even converted an old tool chest into a secure storage unit for personal protection items Keller insisted they keep on hand. "You're a quick learner," Keller remarked one afternoon as they worked on installing a heavy-duty lock on the side gate. She shrugged, her hand steady as she tightened a bolt. "Jesse taught me a lot. He always said it was better to be prepared for the worst." Keller's expression softened. "He was right, and you're proving he taught you well." She didn't respond, but the weight of Keller's words settled over her like a comforting blanket. Jess's absence was a void that could never be filled, but knowing his teachings had prepared her for moments like this made her feel closer to him. As the shop became more secure, word of the incident began to spread through the small town. Customers who had once brought their cars in for repairs now stopped by just to check on she. Some offered words of encouragement, others offered help with the shop's restoration. But not all the attention was positive. One afternoon, as she was tightening a loose bolt on a workbench, she heard the familiar rumble of motorcycles in the distance. Her heart clenched, and she instinctively reached for the wrench beside her. The roar grew louder, and moments later, 3 bikes pulled into the yard. It wasn't Mitch and his crew this time. These bikers were older, their leather jackets worn and patched with insignias of a local motorcycle club. The leader, a grizzled man with a gray beard and piercing blue eyes, dismounted first. He approached she with an air of authority that was more commanding than threatening. "You she Daniels?" he asked, his voice gravelly. She nodded cautiously. "Who's asking?" "Name's Ray," he said, extending a calloused hand. "I run the Iron Raptors. Heard you've been having some trouble." She hesitated before shaking his hand. "You could say that." Ray glanced around the yard, his sharp eyes taking in the new security measures. "Mitch Callahan's crew is bad news. They've been stirring up trouble all over town, but coming after you, that was a mistake." "And why do you care?" she asked, crossing her arms. Ray's expression darkened. "Because Mitch's gang doesn't represent us. They're a bunch of punks giving bikers a bad name, and we don't take kindly to that." Keller stepped out of the shop then, his presence immediately drawing the attention of Ray and his men. The tension in the air was palpable, but Ray simply nodded in acknowledgement. "Friend of yours?" Ray asked, his tone neutral. "Something like that," she replied. "He's helping me handle everything." Ray grunted. "Good. You're gonna need all the help you can get. Mitch doesn't back down easy." "Why are you here, Ray?" Keller interjected, his tone measured. Ray met his gaze evenly. "To offer our support. Mitch's crew is a problem for everyone, not just her. If you're going to take them on, you don't have to do it alone. She exchanged a glance with Keller, her instincts warring with her need for allies. The Iron Raptors didn't have a clean reputation, but they seemed genuine in their disdain for Mitch's crew. "We'll think about it," Keller said finally, his tone leaving no room for argument. Ray nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Fair enough. Just know we're here if you need us." He turned to She, his eyes softening slightly. "You've got guts, Daniels. Don't lose that." With that, Ray and his men mounted their bikes and roared off, leaving She and Keller to process the unexpected encounter. That night, as she locked up the shop, she couldn't shake the feeling that things were escalating. The bikers' attack, the arrival of the Iron Raptors, and Keller's continued presence, it all felt like pieces of a larger puzzle she couldn't yet see. Standing in the darkened shop, she glanced at the photo of Jesse on the wall. His smile was frozen in time, a stark contrast to the turmoil she was facing now. "I don't know what to do," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm trying to be strong, but it feels like everything's falling apart." The weight of her words hung in the air, unanswered, but as she turned to leave, she felt a flicker of resolve ignite within her. Jess had always believed in her strength, and she wasn't about to let him down. The storm was coming, and she would be ready. The storm gathers. The days following the Iron Raptors' visit passed in uneasy silence, the kind of calm that She Daniels had learned to distrust. Every rumble of an engine, every unexpected sound outside her shop, set her nerves on edge. Though she busied herself with repairs and reinforcing her property, the knowledge that Mitch Callahan and his crew were out there, planning their next move, was a constant shadow over her shoulder. Agent Thomas Keller was equally uneasy. He spent his days monitoring the shop's new security system and making calls to old contacts, trying to gather any intelligence on Mitch's activities. His presence, though stoic and calming, only emphasized the seriousness of the situation. She knew he wasn't just there as a favor to Jesse. He was preparing for a fight. One afternoon, as she finished replacing the brakes on a customer's truck, the bell above the shop's front door jingled. Wiping her hands on a rag, she looked up to see an unfamiliar woman standing in the doorway. The woman was tall and lean, with sharp features and a leather jacket that looked more functional than decorative. Her dark hair was pulled back into a tight braid, and her eyes, piercing and observant, locked onto She. "You must be She Daniels," the woman said, her tone cool and direct. She straightened, her body instinctively tensing. "Who's asking?" "Name's Alina," the woman replied, stepping further into the shop. "I work with Ray and the Iron Raptors. He thought I should stop by." She crossed her arms, her expression wary. "Why? Ray already made it clear where he stands." Alina nodded, her gaze flicking around the shop as if assessing its defenses. "He did, but Mitch isn't the type to let things go. Word is, he's planning something big." Keller appeared from the back office, his sharp eyes immediately zeroing in on the newcomer. "And what exactly have you heard?" he asked, his voice a mix of curiosity and suspicion. Alina didn't flinch under his scrutiny. "Mitch's crew has been recruiting. They're pulling in strays from other towns, promising them a share in whatever chaos they're planning. From what I've gathered, they're gearing up for more than just intimidation." She felt a chill run down her spine. "You're saying they're coming back here? For me?" Alina nodded. "For you, for the shop, for anyone who stands in their way. Mitch sees this as a matter of pride now. You embarrassed him, and he won't stop until he's even." Keller's jaw tightened. "Then we hit first." Alina raised an eyebrow. "Not sure that's the best idea. Mitch thrives on violence. If you escalate, he'll just double down. And if we wait," Keller countered, "we're playing his game. That's not an option." She stepped between them, her voice firm. "Enough. This is my fight, and I'm not going to let it tear this town apart. If Mitch wants a war, we'll give him one, but on my terms." Keller and Alina exchanged a look, and though neither said it aloud, they both seemed to acknowledge that she was no longer just a widow running a shop. She was a force to be reckoned with. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she and Keller sat in the office, sketching out a plan. The security footage from the night of the fire had proven invaluable, capturing clear images of Mitch and his crew in action. Keller had already sent copies to his contacts in law enforcement, but he knew the wheels of justice turned slowly in cases like this. If the cops won't act fast enough, Keller said, tapping a pen against the desk, then we have to make sure Mitch knows he can't touch you again. She leaned back in her chair, exhaustion evident in her features. What do you suggest? More cameras? Reinforcements? That won't stop them if they come with more people. No, Keller said, his voice low. But we can make this place less appealing as a target. He outlined his plan, detailing how they could turn the shop into a veritable stronghold. Floodlights would illuminate the yard at all times. Motion sensors would activate alarms loud enough to wake the entire neighborhood, and hidden cameras would provide live feeds directly to Keller's phone. She listened, nodding at each suggestion, but there was still a gnawing sense of inevitability in her chest. They won't care, she said quietly. Mitch isn't coming here to win. He's coming here to make a statement, to prove he can. Keller studied her for a moment. Then we make sure his statement costs him everything. The first real test came 2 nights later. She was in the office, reviewing the day's earnings, while Keller sat by the monitors, watching the security feeds. The night was quiet, almost unnervingly so, when the motion sensors near the back fence lit up the screen. Got movement, Keller said, his voice sharp. She hurried to his side, her stomach dropping as she saw 3 figures creeping along the fence line. They weren't Mitch's crew, at least not anyone she recognized, but they were armed with crowbars and spray cans. Scouts, Keller muttered, testing the waters. What do we do? She asked, her voice tight. Keller grabbed his radio and signaled to Alina, who was stationed nearby with 2 other Iron Raptors. We've got visitors. Time to say hello. Minutes later, the distinct rumble of motorcycles broke the silence. The intruders froze, their heads snapping toward the sound as 3 Raptors roared into the yard, their headlights blazing. One of the men panicked and bolted, but the other 2 stood their ground, their crowbars raised defensively. Alina dismounted, her movements slow and deliberate. You boys lost, she called out, her voice carrying easily over the noise. The men exchanged a nervous glance before one of them spoke. We're just looking around. No need to get all worked up. Looking around. Alina's tone was mocking. Funny, I didn't realize breaking and entering was part of a tour. The situation escalated quickly. Keller stepped into the yard, his presence immediately shifting the balance. The intruders took one look at him, his sharp eyes, his confident stride, and decided they were outmatched. Without a word, they dropped their crowbars and ran. As the sound of their retreating footsteps faded, Keller turned to Alina. Think they'll report back to Mitch? She nodded grimly. No doubt about it. She stepped out into the yard then, her expression a mix of frustration and determination. So now they know we're ready. What happens next? Keller's eyes darkened. Now we wait. But it won't be long. As the night stretched on, she found herself standing by the window, staring out at the darkened yard. The events of the evening had only solidified her resolve. Mitch Callahan and his crew weren't just after her. They were after everything Jesse had worked to build, and she wouldn't let them take it. Behind her, Keller's voice broke the silence. You're thinking too much. She turned, a small smile tugging at her lips. And you're not thinking enough. He chuckled softly. Fair enough. But for what it's worth, you're doing good. Jesse would be proud. The mention of Jess's name hit her like a jolt, but instead of the usual ache, it brought a sense of peace. She nodded, her voice quiet but firm. I hope so, because I'm not done yet. The storm was coming, but Daniels was ready. And this time, She wouldn't face it alone. The battle begins. The tension was palpable, hanging in the air like an oppressive storm cloud. Days had passed since the attempted break-in, and she Daniels knew they were living on borrowed time. Mitch Callahan wouldn't take long to make his move, and when he did, he would bring more than just scouts. She stood in the shop's main garage, her hands gripping a crowbar. It was heavy, reassuring, and ready for whatever came her way. Agent Thomas Keller was in the office, methodically scanning the security feeds, while Alina and two of the Iron Raptors, Ray and a younger member named Gabe, patrolled the perimeter. They had created a small but formidable team, bound by a shared goal, protecting the shop and sending Mitch a message he wouldn't forget. The first sign of trouble came just past midnight. The motion sensors near the eastern fence went off, triggering a cascade of alarms and floodlights. The yard, previously shrouded in darkness, was suddenly bathed in harsh white light. Keller bolted out of the office, his face grim. "They're here," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos unfolding outside. She felt her pulse quicken, but she nodded, forcing herself to stay calm. "How many?" Keller checked the monitors. "At least 8. Mitch is with them." A cold knot formed in her stomach. 8 men, possibly armed, and all of them hell-bent on proving a point. But she wasn't the same person she had been when they first torched her car. She had prepared for this. "Let's move," Keller ordered, signaling to Alina and the Raptors over the radio. The plan they had spent days refining sprang into action. Keller and Ray took positions near the main gate, where the bikers would likely try to force entry. She and Alina stayed inside, guarding the shop itself. Gabe, the youngest of the group, manned the cameras, ready to relay real-time updates. The sound of motorcycles revving echoed through the night, followed by the unmistakable crunch of boots on gravel. Mitch's voice rang out, loud and mocking. "She Daniels, you hiding in there?" he called, his tone dripping with false bravado. "Come out and talk like a grown-up." She exchanged a glance with Alina, who rolled her eyes. "He's trying to rattle you. Don't let him." "I'm not scared of him," she replied, gripping her crowbar tighter. Outside, Mitch continued his taunts. "You think your little fortress is gonna keep us out? You don't get it, lady. This isn't just about you anymore. This is about respect." Ray's voice crackled over the radio. "They're trying to cut the chain on the front gate. We got 3 out here, Mitch, Dylan, and 1 other." "Let them try," Keller responded, his tone icy. Seconds later, the sharp sound of metal hitting metal rang out as Mitch's crew began hacking at the reinforced chain. It wouldn't hold forever, but it didn't need to. The plan was to delay them, force them to make noise, and waste time while the defenders positioned themselves. Keller said, glancing at her, "When they come in, remember, stay controlled. Don't let their numbers intimidate you." "I know," she replied. "Let them come." It didn't take long for the bikers to breach the gate. The chain snapped with a loud clang, and the iron doors swung open. Mitch led the charge, flanked by Dylan and a hulking man with a shaved head. Behind them, 5 more bikers poured in, their footsteps heavy and purposeful. Keller and Ray were waiting. "Welcome to the party," Keller called out, stepping into the floodlight's glare. His calm, composed demeanor stopped the bikers in their tracks. "Hope you brought more than just bad attitudes." Mitch sneered. "You think you're funny, old man? You're outnumbered. Step aside, and maybe we'll go easy on you." Keller smirked. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Ray stepped forward, his imposing frame adding weight to Keller's words. "You made a mistake coming here, Mitch." Mitch's grin faltered, but only for a moment. "I don't think so. This shop's going up in flames tonight, and there's nothing you can do to stop it." Behind him, Dylan lit a Molotov cocktail, the flickering flame casting eerie shadows on his face. "Hope you like fireworks," he shouted, raising the bottle. But before he could throw it, a sharp whistle cut through the air. Alina, perched on the roof of the shop, had a slingshot in hand, and with a quick flick of her wrist, she sent a steel ball bearing hurtling toward Dylan's hand. It struck with a loud crack, and the Molotov fell to the ground, shattering harmlessly at his feet. "Oops," Alina called out, her voice dripping with mockery. "Looks like you dropped something." Dylan howled in pain, clutching his hand, while Mitch turned his glare upward. "You think this is a joke?" "No," Keller said, stepping forward. "But I think you are." The tension exploded into action. Mitch's crew charged forward, but Keller and Ray were ready. Keller moved with the precision of a seasoned fighter, disarming the first man who approached him and delivering a swift punch that sent him sprawling. Ray, with his brute strength, tackled another biker, pinning him to the ground. Inside the shop, she and Alina braced themselves. One of the bikers broke off from the main group, heading for the side entrance. The motion sensor above the door beeped, and she gripped her crowbar, her breath steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The door rattled as the biker tried to force it open. She glanced at Alina, who gave her a nod. When the door finally gave way, the biker burst in, only to be met with the swing of Shi's crowbar. The blow landed squarely on his shoulder, and he stumbled back, cursing. "You picked the wrong shop," she said, her voice low and firm. The biker lunged at her, but Alina intercepted him, landing a solid punch that sent him crashing into a stack of tires. "Stay down," she warned, her voice ice-cold. Outside, the fight raged on. Mitch and Keller square off, their clash as much a battle of wills as it was of fists. Mitch was strong, but Keller was faster, his years of training giving him the edge. "You think you're a hero," Mitch snarled, swinging wildly. "This isn't your fight." "It is now," Keller shot back, dodging the blow and delivering a precise kick to Mitch's knee. The biker stumbled, but his fury kept him on his feet. Meanwhile, Ray and Gabe held their ground against the remaining bikers, using their sheer grit and determination to keep the attackers at bay. The floodlights illuminated the chaos, casting long shadows that flickered like flames. As the battle wore on, it became clear that Mitch's crew had underestimated their opponents. One by one, the bikers fell back, their confidence crumbling under the weight of Keller's strategy and Shi's defiance. Mitch, bloodied and exhausted, finally called for a retreat. "This isn't over," he shouted, his voice hoarse as he climbed onto his bike. "You'll regret this." Keller watched him go, his expression calm but unyielding. "We'll be waiting." As the last of the bikers disappeared into the night, the yard fell silent once more. She leaned against the wall of the shop, her crowbar still in hand, her breath coming in short bursts. Keller approached her, his face softening. "You did good," he said simply. She nodded, the weight of the night settling over her. "It's not over, though." "No," Keller agreed. "But they know now. They can't break you." She looked out at the yard, at the wreckage left behind. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself a small, weary smile. Mitch Callahan had come for her, and he had failed. The battle was over, but the war was far from won, and Shi Daniels was ready for whatever came next. The reckoning. The aftermath of the battle left Shi Daniels' yard littered with broken tools, scuffed gravel, and the lingering scent of smoke. The night had been long, but the adrenaline that had coursed through her veins was now replaced with an aching fatigue. She stood in the center of the yard, surveying the damage. Though Mitch Callahan and his gang had retreated, she knew the fight wasn't truly over. Agent Thomas Keller approached from behind, his steps slow and measured. His shirt was torn, and a dark bruise was forming on his jaw, but his eyes were sharp as ever. "We bought ourselves some time," he said, his voice steady. "But it won't last. Mitch won't let this slide." She turned to him, exhaustion etched into her features. "Then we finish it. I'm done waiting for him to strike. It's time to end this." Keller studied her, his expression unreadable. "You're sure? Once we push back, there's no going back." Shi's jaw tightened. "I wasn't looking for this fight. But it came to me. Now I'm finishing it. The next morning, the team regrouped. Elena, Ray, and Gabe sat in the office, their faces serious as they discussed their options. Keller leaned against the desk, arms crossed, while she paced the room, her movements restless. "We need to draw them out," Keller began. "Mitch thrives on control. If we take that away, he'll make a mistake." Elena nodded. "Agreed. But how do we get him to come to us on our terms?" She stopped pacing, her eyes narrowing in thought. "We hit him where it hurts. His reputation. Mitch runs on fear and loyalty. If we make him look weak, his crew will start to question him." "How?" Gabe asked, his voice tinged with skepticism. She turned to Keller. "The security footage. The break-in, the fire, the fight. We have it all. We make sure everyone sees it. We let the town know who Mitch really is, a thug who can't back up his threats." Keller raised an eyebrow. "Public humiliation. Bold move." "It's more than bold," Elena interjected. "It's risky. If Mitch feels cornered, he could escalate." She's voice was firm. "He's already escalated. This isn't just about me or the shop anymore. It's about stopping him before he destroys anyone else's life." The room fell silent for a moment before Ray spoke up. "She's right. Mitch has been terrorizing this town for too long. It's time someone stood up to him." Keller nodded. "Then we do it. But we don't just rely on the footage. We prepare for the worst." The plan came together quickly. Keller's contacts in law enforcement agreed to provide backup, though they warned it would take time to secure an arrest warrant. In the meantime, she and her team focused on spreading the footage. Helena edited the videos into a concise, damning compilation that showed Mitch's crew in action, setting the fire, breaking into the yard, and retreating in defeat. Ray's network of local connections ensured the footage spread like wildfire. Within hours, it was being shared across social media and played on screens in bars and cafes. The town, long intimidated by Mitch's crew, began to turn against him. People started to talk, and the whispers grew louder. Mitch Callahan wasn't invincible. Mitch's response was swift and predictable. By nightfall, his gang was on the move again. This time, there were more of them, at least a dozen, and their intent was clear. They weren't coming to intimidate. They were coming to destroy. Keller stood by the monitors, his face grim as the motion sensors lit up one by one. "They're here." She joined him, her expression unflinching. "Let them come." The yard was ready. The team had fortified the perimeter with barricades and strategically placed obstacles. Floodlights bathed the area in harsh white light, and the sound of sirens blared from hidden speakers, designed to disorient and confuse. The bikers charged in, their shouts drowned out by the noise. Mitch was at the forefront, his face twisted with rage. "You think you can humiliate me?" he roared. "You think you're untouchable?" Keller stepped into the light, his presence commanding. "Turn back, Mitch. You've already lost." Mitch laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "You think some videos and lights are enough to stop me? I'll burn this place to the ground." He motioned for his crew to advance, but they hesitated. The footage had done its work. Doubt lingered in their eyes, a seed of fear planted by Mitch's previous failures. She stepped forward then, her crowbar resting on her shoulder. "You want me, Mitch? Here I am." Her defiance was like a spark in the darkness, igniting something in the hearts of those watching. Mitch's bravado faltered for a moment, but his anger quickly took over. He charged toward her, his movements wild and uncoordinated. She didn't back down. When he swung at her, she sidestepped, using his momentum against him. The crowbar came down hard, striking his knee and sending him sprawling to the ground. The yard erupted into chaos. Keller and the others engaged the rest of the bikers, their movements precise and deliberate. Elena took down 2 men with a series of well-placed strikes, while Ray and Gabe held the line near the gate, preventing anyone from escaping. Mitch tried to rise, but she was there, her foot pressing down on his chest. "It's over," she said, her voice cold. "You're done." For the first time, Mitch looked afraid. He struggled, but her grip didn't falter. The sound of sirens in the distance signaled the arrival of law enforcement, and Mitch's crew began to scatter, abandoning their leader. By the time the police arrived, it was over. Mitch was handcuffed and hauled away, his threats reduced to incoherent muttering. His crew, fragmented and leaderless, faded into the night. She stood in the yard, her crowbar still in hand, as the officers took statements and assessed the damage. Keller approached, his face weary but triumphant. "You did it," he said. She shook her head. "We did it." As the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, she looked around at her battered but still standing shop. It wasn't just a building anymore. It was a symbol of resilience, a testament to the strength Jesse had seen in her all along. The fight was over, but her journey was just beginning. She Daniels wasn't just surviving anymore. She was rebuilding, stronger than ever. And no one, no Mitch Callahan or anyone else, would take that from her again. Rising from the ashes, the morning light revealed the full extent of the chaos from the night before. The yard was littered with debris, scattered tools, broken barricades, and the unmistakable signs of a battle hard fought. Yet amidst the destruction, there was an undeniable sense of victory. The shop still stood, the bikers were gone, and Mitch Callahan was in custody. For the first time in weeks, the oppressive weight of fear had lifted. She Daniels stood at the entrance to her shop, her crowbar still dangling from her hand. Her muscles ached, her knuckles were raw, but her spirit was intact. She had done what no one in town had dared to do. She had stood up to Mitch Callahan and won. Agent Thomas Keller joined her, his arms crossed as he surveyed the scene. He looked every bit as exhausted as she felt, his face marked with bruises from the fight. Despite this, there was a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You know," he said, breaking the silence, "not many people would have had the guts to face down a gang like Mitch's." She glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "I didn't have much of a choice." "You had a choice," Keller countered. "You could have run, could have let the police handle it, but you didn't." She exhaled, the tension slowly draining from her shoulders. Because running wouldn't have stopped them. Mitch would have kept coming until there was nothing left of this place. "And now?" Keller asked. She looked around, taking in the damage with a critical eye. "Now I rebuild. Better than before, stronger than before." As the day progressed, the community began to show up. One by one, neighbors, customers, and even a few strangers trickled in, offering their help. Some brought tools and materials, others brought food and coffee, and still others simply came to offer their gratitude. "You stood up for all of us," said an older man named Frank, who owned the hardware store down the street. "Mitch has been terrorizing this town for years. We owe you." She shook her head. "You don't owe me anything. I just did what had to be done." But the townsfolk disagreed. They set to work, helping her clean up the yard, repair the damaged fences, and repaint the shop sign. It wasn't just about fixing the shop. It was about reclaiming their town. Alina and the Iron Raptors worked alongside them, their presence a reassuring reminder that she wasn't alone. Ray supervised the repairs with the precision of a foreman, while Gabe handled the heavier lifting. Even Alina, normally aloof, seemed more at ease, her sharp tongue softened by the camaraderie of the moment. By the afternoon, she found herself standing by the blackened remains of her car, the same one Mitch's crew had torched weeks ago. The sight of it still stung, a bitter reminder of everything she'd lost. But as she stared at the charred metal, a spark of determination ignited within her. She turned to Ray, who was nearby, hammering nails into a new section of fencing. "Think you could help me with something?" Ray straightened, wiping sweat from his brow. "What do you need?" She gestured to the car. "I want to rebuild it." He raised an eyebrow. "That's a tall order. It's pretty far gone." "I know," she said. "But it's not just a car. It's a part of Jessie, and I'm not letting Mitch take that from me. Ray studied her for a moment before nodding. All right, let's do it. As the days turned into weeks, the shop slowly came back to life. The yard was cleared, the fences were reinforced, and the security system was upgraded even further. She and Ray worked tirelessly on the car, stripping away the damaged parts and carefully rebuilding it piece by piece. It wasn't easy. There were moments when the task felt overwhelming, when the weight of everything she'd been through threatened to pull her under. But every time doubt crept in, she thought of Jesse, his unwavering belief in her, his determination to protect her even in death. And she kept going. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she stood in the garage, staring at the nearly completed car. The sleek lines of the chassis gleamed under the fluorescent lights, a testament to her resilience and determination. Keller entered quietly, his footsteps echoing on the concrete floor. "It's looking good," he said, nodding toward the car. She smiled faintly. "It's almost done. Just a few more touches." Keller leaned against the workbench, his expression thoughtful. "You've come a long way." Not just with the car, with everything. She glanced at him, her brow furrowing. "It doesn't feel like it's over." "It never really is," Keller admitted. "There's always another fight, another challenge. But you've proven you can handle it." She considered his words, then nodded. "Thanks, Keller, for everything." He smiled, a rare moment of warmth breaking through his usual stoicism. Jessie would be proud. The mention of Jessie brought a lump to her throat, but it was a good kind of ache. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living, fighting, and building something new. A few days later, the car was finally finished. She stood back, admiring the gleaming black sedan that now sat proudly in the center of the garage. It wasn't just a car. It was a symbol of everything she had endured and overcome. As she climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key, the engine roared to life, smooth and powerful. A smile spread across her face as she gripped the steering wheel, feeling a sense of accomplishment she hadn't felt in years. Daniels had faced the storm and emerged stronger. Mitch Callahan was gone, the shop was thriving, and the car, a piece of Jess's legacy, was whole again. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to face whatever came next. And she knew, without a doubt, that she would never face it alone.